Hi, my name is Corey Tripletti. I'm from Cisco WebEx, and I'm very excited to continue our webinar series today with a very special topic, with a very cool speaker. We're very happy to welcome Nir Eyal, who is a best-selling author. His most recent book is Indistractable, which is How to Control Your Attention and Choose Your Life. And I'm personally really excited to have Nir here today. I'm what we might consider a fanboy of his. I liked his previous book, Hooked. I like this book, Indistractable. He's been writing for a lot of time around this concept called behavioral design. And it involves user experience, behavioral economics, and a whole lot more. And he helps me as I like to read through his stuff, and helps me think about approaching things and how we work and how we operate. And just coming out of the world of advertising like I did and like he did, it's just a great way to help you question the ways that you approach things to find a better method of operating. So I'm really, really excited to have Nir here. Nir is joining us from, no joke, really far away. So Nir, good morning or good evening, I guess.
Hey, Corey, great to see you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, thank you. So why don't you tell us a little bit about background, and then let's just dive right into what the concept of the conversation is going to be.
Absolutely, yeah. So really glad to be here with everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. And today's conversation is going to be about how do we become indistractable, what I would call the skill of the century. And a little bit about my background. So a few years ago, I wrote a book called Hooked, which was all about how to build habit-forming products. And the idea behind that book, it came out of a class that I taught at the Stanford Graduate School of Business and then later at the Hasso-Plattner Institute of Design at Stanford. And the idea behind that book, this was published 6 years ago, it was all about how we could democratize the techniques that companies like Facebook, the gaming companies, companies like Slack, and all kinds of companies that you think of when you think about a high engagement, habit-forming product. What I wanted to do was to take those techniques, their strategies, their secrets, so to speak, from a psychology perspective, and to allow everyone in business to use them to build habits that help people improve their lives, healthy habits, if you will. And that's exactly what's happened. So in the past 6 years, all sorts of companies in every imaginable industry have used the techniques I described in Hooked to build healthy habits. Companies like Fitbod, that gets people hooked to the habit of exercising in the gym. Companies like Kahoot, the world's largest educational software, gets kids hooked to classroom learning. Companies like the New York Times I've worked with to get people hooked to engaging with current affairs. So there's all kinds of ways we can use these techniques for good, but of course there's a flip side. The other side of the coin is that sometimes products are made to be so engaging, so habit-forming, that sometimes we find ourselves getting distracted. And so the moment of reckoning for me when I had to really reconsider my own relationship with distraction came a few years after I wrote Hooked, when I was sitting with my daughter. We had this beautiful afternoon planned, and we had this activity book of things that daddies and daughters could do together. And one of the activities in the book was to ask each other this question. I remember the question verbatim. The question was, if you could have any superpower, what superpower would you want? I'll never forget the question, but I can't tell you what my daughter said. Because in that moment, I decided for some reason that something important was on my phone, and I just had to check it right away. And by the time I looked up from my device, my daughter was gone. She left the room because she got the message that whatever was on my phone was more important than she was. And she went to go play outside with some toy. And I realized that I'd blown this perfect daddy-daughter moment. And if I'm honest with you, I didn't just get distracted when I was with my daughter. I would get distracted when I was at my desk, and I would say, okay, I'm definitely going to finish this big project. I'm going to work without distraction. I'm not going to procrastinate. Here I go. I'm going to get started. And yet I'd find myself 15, 20, 30 minutes later working on something I didn't plan to work on, yet again distracted. I would say to myself, I'm definitely going to exercise today, but I'd skip it. I'd say I was going to eat right, and I wouldn't. And so if you asked me today what superpower I would want, I tell you, I'd want the power to be indistractable. This skill of the century. Today there is no facet in our life that doesn't depend upon us giving our full time and attention to one thing at a time. And this is a very scarce commodity. If you think about it, there's a reason that we call it paying attention. There is value to that time and attention. And the world today is bifurcating between people who allow their time and attention to be squandered and manipulated by others, and people who stand up and say, no, I am indistractable. I control my time. I control my attention. I control my life. So over the past 5 years, I've immersed myself in the psychology of distraction to try and figure out why is it that we do things against our better judgment. And what I learned is that this is not a new problem. That in fact, Plato, the philosopher, 2,500 years ago, coined this term, akrasia in the Greek, which means doing things against our better judgment. And this is such a mystery. You know, Plato wondered 2,500 years ago, well before the iPhone, well before YouTube, well before all the things we think are so distracting these days, he wondered why is it that despite knowing what to do, we don't do it, right? Even Plato observed that we fall off track. And even despite the fact that we know we should exercise, we know we should eat right, we know we should do all these things, somehow we don't do what we say we're going to do. And so this is just such a fascinating question that I wanted to get to the bottom of it. Why do we sometimes act against our better judgment? What is the root cause of distraction? What is the root cause of akrasia? One way that we can look at this problem is to understand what distraction is by understanding what distraction is not. So think to yourself for a minute, if I asked you what's the opposite of distraction, what would be your answer? Most people would say it's focus. But that's not exactly right. The opposite of distraction is not actually focus. The opposite of distraction is traction. In fact, if you look at the Latin origin of both words come from the word trahare, which means to pull. And you'll notice as well that traction and distraction both end in the same 6 letters, A-C-T-I-O-N, that spells action. So traction is any action that pulls you towards what you want to do, things that you do with intent, things that help you live out your values and live the kind of life you want. The opposite of traction is distraction, any action that pulls you away from what you plan to do, any action that is not in accordance to the values you want to live your life by. And so this is really important for 2 reasons. Number one, anything can be a distraction. How many times have you sat at your desk and you said, here I go, I'm going to work on this big project, nothing's going to get in my way, I'm not going to get distracted, I'm not going to procrastinate, I'm going to get to work on that big project, here I go. But first, let me check some email. Let me do that one quick thing on my to-do list to get some momentum, right? And then you notice that 15, 20 minutes, maybe 30 minutes later, you're doing something that is not what you plan to do. By definition, that is a distraction. This is something that most people don't realize. You see, this is the most pernicious form of distraction. The one that tricks you, that fools you into prioritizing the urgent at the expense of the important. Because if we're sitting at our desk and we're checking Facebook or playing Candy Crush while we're supposed to be working, that's obvious. We know that we're slacking off. The more dangerous distraction is the one we don't even realize is happening. I'm checking email. That's a productive thing to do. Let me just check some email here real quick. Let me just check that Slack channel. That's a work-related task, right? Well, by definition, if that is not what you plan to do with your time, it is just as much of a distraction as playing a video game. Now, anything can be a distraction, and conversely, anything can be traction. So, you know, there's a lot of blaming of technology these days. We hear it all the time. The media loves this narrative that technology is melting our brains. It's addicting everybody. It's hijacking our minds. We hear it all the time. And it's ridiculous. It's just not true. What is actually happening is that, in fact, if you want to engage in any of these pastimes, do it. There's nothing wrong with playing a video game or watching a great show on Netflix, or whatever it is that you want to do with your time is fine. That's up to you. I'm not going to tell you what to do with your time. Nobody should. What you should do is differentiate between what is distraction and what is traction with one word. And that one word is intent. The time you plan to waste is not wasted time. And so what I want to enable you and empower you to do is, instead of feeling guilty about spending your time enjoying yourself with some kind of pastime, instead, I think it's time we say, I want to waste some time. There's nothing wrong with it, as long as you do it with intent. So when we decide this is what we want to do with our time, we instantly turn distraction into traction. but we have to do it on our schedule, not because some tech company sends us a ping or ding that takes us off track from what we really want to do. All right, so now we understand this dichotomy between traction and distraction. What prompts us to take these actions? Well, two things. The first thing is what we call an external trigger. An external trigger is something in our outside environment, a ping, a ding, a ring, anything that can lead us towards traction or distraction. Now, we're going to get back to what to do about these external triggers. These are the usual suspects. This is what we tend to blame. But it turns out the number one source of distraction is not the external triggers. It's not your phone. It's not the computer. It's not stuff outside of you. But in fact, what time studies show us is that the leading cause of distraction is not what is happening outside of us, but rather most distractions begin from within. We call these internal triggers. Internal triggers are uncomfortable emotional states that we seek to escape from. You see, if we are going to answer Plato's 2,500-year-old question of why do we do things against our better interest, we actually have to back up a step and ask ourselves, why do we do anything and everything? What's the nature of human motivation? It turns out the nature of human motivation is not what most people think of it is. Ask yourself for a minute, what drives people? Why do we do what we do? Most people, if they think about it for a bit, they say, well, isn't it all about pain and pleasure? Right? The pursuit of pleasure and the avoidance of pain. This is what Freud called the pleasure principle. And other people have espoused similar things. Jeremy Bentham said something similar. Turns out, though, that this popular notion of pain and pleasure is not actually accurate. That when we look at what is happening inside the brain from a neurological basis, everything we do is not about the pursuit of pleasure and the avoidance of pain, but rather everything we do for only one reason. And that one reason is the desire to escape discomfort. Everything we do is about the desire to escape discomfort. This is called the homeostatic response. We know this to be true physiologically. Think about it for a minute. If you were to go outside and it's cold, the brain says, oh, this is uncomfortable. You should put on a jacket. And if you walk back inside, now you're too hot. The brain says, that doesn't feel good. Take it off. If you're hungry, you feel hunger pangs, so you eat. And if you eat too much, oh, now you feel stuffed, you stop eating. So those are physiological responses to uncomfortable states. The same thing holds true when it comes to our psychological sensations. Let me ask you, what website or app do people go to when they're feeling lonely? Facebook. Where do we go when we're feeling uncertain? We Google. And what about when we're feeling bored? Well, there's lots of things to take care of this uncomfortable sensation of boredom. We check the news. We look at stock prices. We check Reddit, Pinterest, video games. Lots and lots of products cater to this uncomfortable sensation of boredom. So what this means, if all human behavior is prompted by a desire to escape discomfort, this must mean, therefore, that time management is pain management. Time management is pain management. Let me tell you, I have read countless productivity, time management, life hack books. None of the techniques work. None of them work unless, first and foremost, you learn to master these internal triggers. You will always find escape from discomfort unless you first start with mastering what it is that is driving us to seek escape. That is where we have to start our journey to becoming indistractable. Because look, whether it's too much news, too much booze, too much football, too much Facebook, whatever it is that we are using to escape our present reality, if we don't understand the source of that discomfort, we will always find an emotional salve. We will always find a way to escape. So what do we do about this? We understand that time management is pain management. How do we learn to become indistractable by mastering these internal tricks? We only have two potential options, two options. We can either fix the source of the discomfort, figure out what it is that's causing us this discomfort, and figure out why and stop it, whether that's a difficult home life situation, an oppressive workplace culture, whatever it might be that's causing us this discomfort of anxiety, stress, loneliness, fatigue, uncertainty, whatever it might be that we're running away from. We can either fix the problem But look, a fact of life is that we can't always fix every discomfort, right? That what we have to do, part of living, is that we have to find ways to learn to cope with these internal triggers in a healthy way that leads us to traction rather than a harmful way that leads us towards distraction. So what I want to do is give you just a few techniques throughout the presentation today that are very practical. Now, I have to give you a disclaimer. These are just the tip of the iceberg. There's a lot of stuff I won't have time to cover today, but I wanted to give you something that you could walk away from, a technique today that you could start using. So let me review just a few techniques that you could start using immediately to help you master these internal triggers and become indistractable. The first step, psychologists tell us, is to simply note the sensation. That if we can simply identify that sensation and call it by its name, and even just write it down, that one word of this is boring, or this is difficult, or this is, I'm feeling fearful, I'm feeling uncertain, insecure, whatever it might be, if you can just write that down and name it, that's an incredibly empowering first step and very easy to do. The next step is to become curious rather than contemptuous about that internal trigger. What does that mean? Most people, they become contemptuous with that sensation, and so they fall into one of two buckets. We have what we call the blamers. The blamers, they say, oh, I got distracted because of my iPhone. I got distracted because of Facebook. I got distracted because of Twitter. Oh, here's what I hear all the time these days. I got distracted because the world these days, it's just such a distracting world we live in, right? That's what the blamer says. But of course, that's futile because you can't change any of those things, right? We can't wind back the hands of time. We're powerless to do anything about that. The other extreme is what we call the shamer. The shamer doesn't blame things outside themselves. They shame themselves. So here's what this sounds like. There I go again. I always do this. I have such a short attention span, or I'm lazy, or maybe I'm not very good at this job, or maybe something's wrong with me. That's what the shamer says. Now, of course, that doesn't work either, because what do we feel when we feel shame? We feel more internal triggers, which makes us more likely to do what? Seek escape with more distraction. So that doesn't work either. So we don't want to be a blamer. We don't want to be a shamer. We want to be what we call a claimer. A claimer claims responsibility not for the sensation, not for the internal trigger, not for the urge, but for their response to that sensation. Remember, you cannot control your feelings. Most people don't realize this. You can't control your feelings. You can only control how you respond to those feelings. For example, if you have to sneeze, you don't control whether you feel the urge to sneeze. The only thing you can control is what you will do in response to that urge. Are you going to sneeze all over everyone and get them sick? Or are you going to take out a handkerchief and cover your nose so that you don't infect other people with your cold, right? So we can do something about how we respond to those sensations, hence the word responsibility. And the same goes with our internal triggers. Do we allow them to get the best of us and send us towards distraction, or do we utilize them as rocket fuel to propel us towards traction? So one of the last techniques I want to talk about in this first step of mastering internal triggers is called surfing the urge. You see, when we feel one of these internal triggers, whether it's boredom, whether it's fearfulness, uncertainty, stress, anxiety, it doesn't matter. When we feel these internal triggers, in the moment, it feels like we're going to always feel this way. But of course, that's never the case. That these uncomfortable internal states, they crest and then they subside. And so our job is to be a surfer on a surfboard, surfing that urge, surfing that sensation until it dissipates. Now, how do we do this? One way to do this comes from acceptance and commitment therapy. This technique has been around for a very, very long time. It's called the 10-minute rule. And this is something that you can start using today. I use it all the time. Here's how it works. Let's say you find yourself tempted towards a distraction, tempted to do something you don't really want to do, whether it's eat that piece of chocolate cake you don't really need, or smoke the cigarette, check Google, check the news, work on email when you should be working on that big project, whatever it might be. I want you to tell yourself, instead of saying no, strict abstinence turns out most of the time backfires. Instead, what I want you to tell yourself is that you can give in to any of those urges. Okay, you can give in to them in 10 minutes. Not for 10 minutes. Many people misunderstand how this works. You're not giving into it for 10 minutes. No, no, no. You're giving into it in 10 minutes. Okay? So what do you do for those 10 minutes before you give into the urge? You have two choices. You can either get back to whatever it is you wanted to do, whether you're working on that big project or whatever it is that you said you wanted to do instead of checking the news or checking email or whatever it is. You can either get back to that task at hand or sit with that sensation. Okay? So many times I'll do is I'll take out my phone and say, set a timer for 10 minutes. I'll put my phone down. Now my job is just to sit at my desk for a few minutes and process what it is that I'm experiencing right now. What's going on inside me? What am I feeling? What is this boredom? What's stress, anxiety? What is it that I'm experiencing? And when I'm ready, I can get back to that task at hand. Now, if the clock runs out and 10 minutes are up, I can do that thing that I said I shouldn't do. Okay? But here's what happens. By building this practice, this new habit of instead of impulsively reaching for a distraction, you're strengthening this muscle, this practice, this habit of instead learning to process that sensation. And it turns out 9 times out of 10, when the clock runs out, that urge has crested and subsided. You no longer have that urge. It's an incredibly simple and effective technique to start mastering these internal triggers. Again, it's the tip of the iceberg, lots more we can do, but this is something you can start using tomorrow. The next step to becoming indistractable after we've mastered the internal triggers is to make time for traction. To make time for traction. Here's the thing, folks. Write this down. You cannot call something a distraction unless you know what it distracted you from. Let me say that again. You can't call something a distraction unless you know what it distracted you from. You know, many people who complain about how distracted they are, when you look at their calendars, they're blank. A bunch of white space, maybe a meeting here, an appointment there. But for most of their day, they don't know what they wanted to do with their time. Well, how can you say you got distracted if you don't know what you got distracted from? One of the most effective techniques that thousands of peer-reviewed studies have found helps us stay on track. It's called making an implementation intention, which is just a very fancy way of saying planning what you're going to do and when you're going to do it. How do we do this? In this day and age, if you don't plan your day, somebody is going to plan it for you. And I mean down to the minute. If you don't decide in advance how you want to spend your time, your boss, your kids, the news, Twitter, somebody has an incentive to take that time, to steal that time from you unless you decide in advance how you want to spend it. So what we have to do is a technique called making a time box calendar, not just for the worky stuff. I don't want you to be an automaton and do nothing but work all day. I want you to decide. Remember what we said earlier, you can turn distraction into traction by making time for it in your day. This way, you can watch Netflix without guilt. You can enjoy time with your kids without thinking you should be checking email. You can work on that big project knowing that that's exactly what you should do with your time. Plan that time in advance or somebody is going to plan it for you. What we want to do is to make time for traction by planning the time, not the output. I'm about to kill a sacred cow. We've all been told that to get things done, we have to use to-do lists, right? Hasn't everyone heard this advice that productive people keep to-do lists? Let me ask you something. I want you to answer honestly here. If you keep a to-do list, how many days per week do you actually finish everything on that to-do list? I'm guessing that for most of you, this was certainly my case, the answer is no days per week do you finish everything on that to-do list. Because the vast majority of people who keep to-do lists as their list of the output in their day don't finish everything on the to-do list. And the reason this is so toxic, the reason this is not working for us anymore, is because what's happening is every day you don't finish everything on your to-do list, you are reinforcing your identity as someone who doesn't finish, as someone who can't be counted on, as someone who doesn't have the personal integrity to do what they say they're going to do. And it seems like no big deal. But day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year, telling yourself that every day, even if it's subconsciously, makes you believe it until one day you say, well, it's fine. Okay, I'll just push it to tomorrow or the next day or the next day. And that's it. You've lost. It's over. Instead of these stupid to-do lists, which are nothing more than a list of output, For any output, we need input. What is our input as knowledge workers? What goes in to the work we have to do? Two things: time and attention. That's it. Knowledge workers' input is time and attention. We can't finish the things we have to finish without those two factors. But what most people do is say, I have a big long to-do list, all the output with no input. And of course, that can't work. That doesn't make sense. That's making something out of nothing. Instead of a to-do list, what I want you to try instead is that time box calendar. Because think about the psychology of keeping a time box calendar. When you make a time box calendar, what you are doing with every block of time is making the only goal not to finish anything. You hear what I just said? Did you listen carefully? The goal is to not finish anything. The goal of a to-do list is to finish stuff. Finish this, finish this, finish this. And that's why they don't work. Because study after study shows that people are terrible at predicting how long something takes to finish. You know this. There's too many exogenous factors. You need to do a presentation, but Jimmy didn't send you the graphics, and Barbara doesn't have the numbers yet, and so stuff takes longer than you expected. That happens all the time, right? Instead of measuring yourself by how much you finished, I want you to start measuring yourself by how long you were able to work on a task for as long as you said you would without distraction. That is your only goal, to work on a task for as long as you said you would without distraction. Why? Because if you work for 15 minutes, 20 minutes, an hour, I don't care. Every time you finish that time blocks, you are reinforcing to yourself you did it. You did what you said you were going to do. And that reinforces your identity as being a person who lives with personal integrity. You are indistractable. And here's the kicker. Here's the kicker. The people who use time box calendars actually finish more than the people who keep the to-do list. They are actually more productive at finishing the output than the people who just keep these to-do lists, which I'm telling you not to do. Okay? So plan the time, not the output. Keep these time box calendars. And one of the things we have to make sure we make time for in our calendar is time to think. You see, the average American knowledge worker spends almost no time concentrating because all their time is spent communicating. You know exactly what I'm talking about. Time studies show that if you exclude two things from the average knowledge worker's day, meetings and email, they're left with about an hour and a half for everything else we have to do in our day. That's an abomination. Because today, your competitive advantage is directly proportional to how much time you have to think. And if your job requires you to think, I mean, look, what do we do as knowledge workers? Our job is to come up with novel solutions to hard problems. That's what we get paid for. I don't care what your title is. That's what you do. You come up with novel solutions to hard problems. But you can't do that unless you have time to think. So what I want you to make sure you have on your calendar is time to do that reflective work, not just the responsive work. The responsive work is the pings and dings and email and phone calls and Slack channels. You have to do that. That's certainly part of your day. But I want you also to carve out that precious time to make sure you have time to think throughout your day as well. This is where we strategize, we plan, we think big thoughts, we make our grand plans. It has to be protected, or it's just going to get run over by all the pings and dings and reactive work we have to do throughout our day. So protect that time. Now, the next step to becoming indistractable is about making sure that we can hack back the external triggers. We talked a little bit about external triggers, you know, all the pings and dings and notifications throughout our day. Now, there's one industry where hacking back these external triggers is literally a matter of life and death. If I were to ask you to think about for a moment, what's the third leading cause of death in the United States of America? What's the third leading cause of death? I'll give you the first two. Number one is heart disease. Number two is cancer. If it were a disease, believe it or not, the third leading cause of death would be prescription mistakes. Prescription mistakes. People inside hospitals receiving the wrong medication or the wrong dosage of medication by healthcare practitioners. 200,000 Americans are harmed every year by this completely preventable human error. Why does this happen? Distraction. studies have found that on average, when a nurse is dosing out medication, he or she is interrupted on average 10 times per dosing round. Well, why am I telling you this story? I'm guessing very few of you are nurses dosing out medication. I tell you this story because something terrible and tragic happens with these nurses as they're dosing out medication. When they make these mistakes, they get distracted. Somebody taps them on the shoulder, a colleague, doctor, a patient taps them on the shoulder and interrupts them. That's when they make these mistakes. That's when they get distracted. But here's the thing. They don't realize they had made the mistakes until it was too late. It wasn't until they go home and come back the next day that somebody says, did you hear what happened to Mr. Smith? You almost killed him. You gave him the wrong medication. But at the time when the nurse made the mistake, they were completely oblivious to it. This is what's happening to us. We think we're doing a great job, right? We're on top of things. We're doing a great job at our work. And we don't realize how much better we could do our job, how degraded our performance is because we are constantly distracted. We are making mistakes we don't even realize we're making, just as these nurses did. Now, there's a happy ending to this story. That there was a group of nurses from UCSF that decided to take on this challenge. And they wanted to understand how they could fix this problem. They wanted to come up with some novel solutions. They found a simple solution that decreased the number of prescription mistakes by 88%. They almost eliminated this problem. The solution, believe it or not, was not some multi-million-dollar retraining program. It wasn't some fancy new app. It was cheap plastic vests. Plastic vests that these nurses could wear over their garbs that told their colleagues, drug round in progress, do not disturb. This almost eliminated the problem. This is called hacking back an external trigger. Now, again, I know very few of you are nurses. Why am I telling you this story? Because we can use a very similar solution in our own work lives. When you go, I know many of us are working from home these days, but when we go back to our offices, particularly if you work in an open floor plan office, you can use what's called a screen sign. In every copy of my book, Indistractable, it comes with a cardstock pullout that you can fold into thirds. You put it on your computer monitor, and now everyone around you knows that you are indistractable. Now, I'm not saying keep this on your desk all day long, but for that time that you reserve for your reflective work, the time you need to be indistractable, tell your colleagues, nope, that's when the sign is up. That means that I need time to focus. Please don't interrupt during that time. Now, I know many of you are working from home. And one of the challenges of working from home is that we have kids around. And kids can be a source of distraction causing external triggers as well. So what do you do if you have children at home? You can't use this screen sign. They might be too young to read. There's a simple solution. I want you to look around your house and find the silliest hat you have, okay? This is going to be called your concentration crown. And we tell our kids that when daddy is wearing his concentration crown, that means he is not to be disturbed. So we've used this technique for years now. It's incredibly effective because you're interrupting that external trigger of your child walking in. Because if you have to tell your child, oh, I can't talk right now, they don't understand it. They don't understand why, and you've already gotten distracted. So if you just wear something that's a visible sign to hack back that external trigger, it's incredibly effective. Not only is it effective on kids, it's also very effective on spouses as well. So you can use techniques like that. You can also use the technology to hack back triggers caused by the technology. You know, everybody's phone these days comes with this amazing feature called Do Not Disturb While Driving. And here's how it works. If you are worried, well, what if my boss needs to contact me? What if my customers have an emergency when I'm trying to do my focused work? No problem. You use this feature with one button. If someone calls or texts you, they will receive an automatic reply that says, I can't talk right now, but if this is urgent, text me with the word urgent. And if it really is an emergency, all they have to do is text that word, just type in urgent, and now the message will come through. Incredibly effective technique. I've been using it for years. I've never gotten anyone text me the word urgent because they know, okay, he'll call me back when he can. It can take 30 minutes. Nothing's going to happen. Another thing we can do is to remove all of these external triggers from our environment that aren't serving us. How many of us have desktops that look like this? Studies tell us that even if we're not clicking on all these things, all that visual clutter can create a lot of distraction and degrade our performance. So we don't have to live like that. We can clear away all that digital clutter to make sure we can work without distraction. We can do the same thing on our digital devices, like our phones. All those notifications, the pings and dings and rings, we can make sure that we can adjust those notifications so we're not constantly external triggers that are leading us towards distraction. The key here is to ask ourselves this critical question of, is this trigger serving me or am I serving it? Remember, if the external trigger is prompting you to do something you plan to do, if your phone rings because you've got a meeting or it's a reminder that it's time to go exercise or whatever the case might be, that's great. That external trigger is serving you. But if you plan to do something like be with your daughter, as I had, and now my phone is ringing and pulling me away from what I plan to do, now I'm serving it. So we have to ask ourselves, is the technology serving me or am I serving it? And if it's not serving you, get rid of it. Adjust those notification settings. Take a few steps to make sure that you're not constantly interrupted. Very simple step we can all take. And most importantly, we need to make sure that when we are physically present with important people in our lives, we are also mentally present. So whether it's when we return back to the workplace and we have in-person meetings, we need to leave those distracting devices outside. If you're at home with your family and you want to share time together, make sure that we have no phone zones that are sacred to us, like the kitchen table, like whatever it might be. That time is time without our devices so we can be fully present with each other. Finally, the last step to becoming indistractable is about preventing distraction with pacts. Now, this technique comes last, okay? This is what we do after we've mastered the internal triggers, after we've made time for traction, after we've hacked back the external triggers. Then we prevent distraction with pacts. What are pacts? Pacts are pre-commitments that we make with ourselves or other people that become the firewall. They become the last line of defense to make sure we don't get distracted. Now, the first recorded case of someone using one of these pre-commitment devices comes to us from a story of Ulysses 2,500 years ago, written by Homer, the philosopher. He tells us about this Greek hero who has to sail his ship past the island of the Sirens. Now, the Sirens are these mythical creatures who sing a magical song, and anyone who hears the siren song, any sailor who hears the song, crashes his ship onto the shore of the Sirens Island and dies. Now, Ulysses knows this is going to happen. And so to prevent himself from doing something he doesn't want to do, he makes a pre-commitment. He makes a step now to make sure he doesn't get distracted later. What does he do? He tells the men on his ship to put beeswax in their ears so they can't hear the siren song. And he tells them to bind him to the mast of the ship, and he tells them, no matter what I do, no matter what I say, don't let me go. You know what? The plan works. He's able to safely sail his ship home and return his crew safely to harbor. Now, what can we learn from this story? How can we make Ulysses' pact in our own life? We can start by using tech to block out tech distractions. So, for example, on the right there, you'll see an app called Self-Control. Now, this is a wonderful free app that you set in advance. You say, look, when I initiate this app, I want you to block out sites that may lead me towards distraction. So when I need to do my writing, so I've been an author for many years now. I've written 2 bestsellers. It's never gotten easy, full of internal triggers around when it's difficult. All I want to do is just go research something or check something in the news or check email. But I put in those sites like Gmail and Google and Facebook, whatever other site might distract me, into self-control so that those sites are blocked when I'm doing my focused work. Another app that I love is called Forest. Now, this is great for your mobile device. The way Forest works is this. Every time you need to do your reflective work, you open up the Forest app and you hit a little button that says plant. Now, you type in how much time you want to do your reflective work for without distraction, and when you hit that button that says plant, this cute little virtual tree is planted. Now, if you pick up the phone and do anything with it, the little virtual tree dies. And you don't want to be a virtual tree murderer, And so it's a reminder to tell you, nope, that's not what you want to do right now. You don't need to check your phone. You need to stay focused on what it is you wanted to do. It's a pre-commitment, a pact with yourself to stay on track. Another thing you can do is to find a focus friend. So if you can find somebody maybe you're quarantined at home with, if you have a certain time of day that you say, okay, we're going to both do our focus work for this time of day, great. But many of us, if we don't have access to a focus friend, of course we can do this when we get back to the office after this current period. But what we can also do is we can use technology to the rescue. There's a wonderful new website that I like so much. I actually invested in the company. This company is called FocusMate. Here's how it works. You log into FocusMate. You find somebody who also wants to do focused work for a certain time of day. You book that time with them, and you show up at that time. And it's, of course, an incentive to show up, because if you don't show up, they're going to leave you a bad review. So you show up at that time. You see them on your monitor. You see a little video feed of them. This was, you can see here, a screenshot I took. This was when I did a FocusMate session with a medical school student in the Czech Republic, so on the other side of the world. And for that period of time, just seeing someone else hard at work, doing what it is they said they would do, is very motivating, very inspirational. It's unbelievably effective. Simply that idea of having a focus mate to make sure that you make a pact with yourself and with them to do the work you said you would do. So the idea here is to reduce distraction with pacts as the last resort, to use tech to block tech. But I want to warn you here, be careful. This technique can backfire. And it backfires for two reasons. One mistake that people make is that they jump into these pacts, these pre-commitments, prematurely. You have to first do the other three steps of mastering the internal triggers, making time for traction, hacking back the external triggers, and then last, as the firewall, as the last resort, then use these pre-commitment devices. Don't jump ahead of the game. Make sure you do the other three things first. The second word of warning is that we know that for some people, these techniques can backfire. That when they fall off the horse, when they get distracted, as look, we all invariably will get distracted from time to time on the road to becoming indistractable, some people can't get back on track. They quit. And it turns out the people who quit are the ones who are less self-compassionate. People who exhibit high degrees of self-compassion, studies find, are much more likely to reach their long-term goals. So how do we cultivate self-compassion? It's actually quite simple. The way we cultivate self-compassion is to talk to ourselves the way we would talk to a good friend. So for example, if I were to tell you that I messed up with my daughter, that I'm embarrassed about the fact that I planned time to be with her and I got off track. I didn't do what I planned to do, and I got distracted by my phone when I planned to be with someone I love very much. If I told you that as a good friend, would you tell me that I'm a horrible person, that I'm a terrible human being? Not if you were my good friend, you wouldn't. And yet that's the kind of stuff that we say to ourselves all the time. And you know what? It's not helpful, and it's not true. Because clearly that doesn't help us achieve our long-term goals. It doesn't help us exhibit long-term self-compassion. And here's something else that isn't true. This idea that somehow technology is hijacking all our brains, that it's addicting everyone, that there's nothing we can do about it, when clearly there is so much that we can do. We can master the internal triggers. We can make time for traction. We can hack back the external triggers and prevent distraction with pacts. So the message I want to leave with you is that we can do this. We can get the best out of these tools without letting them get the best of us. We can all become indistractable. Thank you very much. And just one quick note, absolutely, one quick note before we start some questions. I would love to hear what you thought of the presentation. So if you'd be so kind, if you can go to this URL, opinion2.us, or if you have an iPhone, you can just point your camera to that QR code and it'll take you straight to the URL. Only 5 questions. Would love to hear what you thought of the presentation. And when you click submit, you will get, on the survey, you will be taken to a link. You'll be given a link to my SlideShare page where you can have all the slides you just saw. Would love to know what you thought of the presentation. And if we don't get to, if you have a further question that we may not get to today, please go to my website, nearandfar.com. There's a contact form there. Happy to hear from you if there's anything I can do.
Thank you, Neer. This is great. It's funny because I know right now you're in Singapore, I'm in California. It's the end of your day. This is the very early beginning of my day. I really wish I had this at the end of my day because it would be such a great way to end the entirety of my day. Like this is just, there's such great information here. I have so many things to say.
Well, apparently you're recording it, so you can watch it anytime you want.
Yes, I can, as a matter of fact. So a couple of things that came up, because a lot of what you're talking about is things that I'm fascinated by, just in general. And I said at the very beginning that I'm a big fan of what you write and the way you approach the way you think. So I definitely just want to appreciate that. But right now we are living in a time period where there is a lot of discomfort. There's a lot of people that are very uncomfortable with what's going on because of the coronavirus, et cetera. So what advice do you have for people right now that are experiencing this discomfort and are working from home and are feeling that it's much more difficult to pay attention right now?
Yeah, it's a great point. It's interesting. I wrote the book well before the current virus crisis, and it's only become more important now for a few reasons. One, that we have more internal triggers in our day. We're feeling more fearful, more stressed, more uncertain about where the world is going. And so we feel the need to escape more than we did beforehand, at least for many people. If they have these problems on their mind, the way that many people escape the discomfort of the uncertainty in the world is to go check the news. And of course, it is our responsibility. Before this corona crisis, I used to tell people, we could all do with a little less news checking. Like, we don't need to keep track of every celebrity nonsense and every political gaffe. It's too much. We didn't need it. But today, I don't give that advice anymore because, keeping informed around what's going on during this crisis can be a matter of life and death. We need to keep informed. We need to understand what's happening. The question is, whose schedule are we doing it on? Are we doing it on the news media schedule? Or are we doing it actually to stay informed, right? Are we doing it because we are looking to escape an uncomfortable sensation or because we actually are looking for information? And so it's very important that we understand the source of why we are doing these things so that we can make sure we do them on our schedule, not somebody else's schedule. The other thing that I think has changed is that, for many of us, working from home has dissolved the constraints of a schedule that we used to have. It's interesting. I just saw the other day that there is an explosion of people searching Google for the term, what day is it? People are losing track of the day of the week. And so we see this curve of people, the crazy increase, an exponential increase in the number of people who just want to know what day it is because they can't keep track of them anymore. Because we don't have the structure of waking up, getting the kids fed, taking them to school, getting into traffic, having to be at the office at a certain time, having the lunch meeting. We don't have those schedules, the routines. And it turns out that constraints actually increase our productivity and our well-being. We need constraints in our day. And so when we have all day to just, do all the things we need to do, it doesn't actually lead to more productivity, even though, the average person should have more time on their hands now, right? They should have not, they're not spending time in traffic. They're not spending time shuttling their kids around for after school programs. They're not spending time in, silly meetings. And, we should have more time. And yet many of us feel like we don't have enough time in our day for some reason. And so part of that is because we're not keeping a schedule. And we don't have anybody enforcing that rigid schedule on us. We don't have to. And in fact, it turns out you're much more likely to adhere to and enjoy keeping a schedule when you make it yourself, when it's done freely. And so I think this is a great opportunity to do what I call turning your values into time. To ask yourself, values are defined as attributes of the person you want to become. That's the definition of a value, attributes of the person you want to become. So what we need to do, the way we fill up our time box calendar is to start with these 3 life domains of you, your relationships, and then your work. To ask yourself, how would the person I want to become spend their time, right? As opposed to, vision boards and 5-year ambitions and regrets of the dying. How about we just start with next week? Or how about tomorrow? How would the person you want to become want to spend their time? How much time would you want to spend on your health, on meditation, prayer, video games, doesn't matter. Whatever it is that are attributes of the person you want to become, how would that person that you want to become spend their time? And book that time in your schedule. And so this is a huge, huge step that we can take to help us become indistractable and restore a lot of what we lost in terms of the constraints that help us live better lives.
Mm-hmm. You know, you talk about the time blocking calendar. That's a tactic I've done for a long time. I'm a big fan of it. But I will also tell you that constantly that time gets paved over. So what do you say to people when they say things like, I don't have time to go do this? Or what do you say to people who say, I'm not even in control of my own calendar, so how can I possibly block that time out?
Yeah. So there's a few things. So one is the way we approach this. So many people, when they see this idea of a time box calendar, they think that they need to be drill sergeants with themselves. And that doesn't work. Instead of being a drill sergeant, we need to be a scientist. What does a scientist do? A scientist makes a hypothesis, they run an experiment, and they draw conclusions around what happened during that experiment so that they can learn from it and make a new hypothesis and start the cycle again. So your job in making a time box calendar is not to pressure yourself to say, oh, right out of the gate, the first calendar I make is the one I'm going to stick with for the rest of my life. No, the idea here is to make that time box calendar based on your values, per what we talked about earlier, and then make adjustments to make the calendar easier to follow, okay? Because there are only 3 reasons for every distraction, either an internal trigger, an external trigger, or a planning problem. That's it. Every distraction is only caused by one of those 3 things. So what we can do the next day or the next week when we make this time box calendar is to adjust it based on, okay, let's see. So I plan to do X, but I didn't do it. Well, why didn't I do it? Was it because of an external trigger, an internal trigger, or a planning problem? If it's an external trigger, how do I hack back that external trigger so it doesn't keep distracting me next time? If it's an internal trigger, how do I arm myself with the habits and techniques so that I can disarm these uncomfortable emotional states and turn them into traction rather than distraction? If it's a planning problem, I plan to do X and I didn't have enough time for that, or I had too much time for that, how can I adjust it accordingly? The idea here is to draw on a quote that I love, that I repeat almost every day, by Paulo Coelho, who says, a mistake repeated more than once is a decision. A mistake repeated more than once is a decision. If you get distracted once, free pass. No problem. Happens to all of us. If you keep getting distracted, you're deciding to be distracted. So people say, I didn't expect it. I got distracted. I went off schedule. I couldn't follow my schedule because of traffic. Really? Traffic? It happens every day.
Yeah.
If you know it might happen, plan more time for it. So if it happens once, free pass. If it keeps happening, now it's your fault. Now we can take steps to make sure it doesn't keep happening in the future. There's all kinds of ways we can do that. By the way, we need to allow time, if it is part of our job, to have that reactive work. Remember we talked about the difference between reactive work and reflective work? Everybody's job has some balance of that. So if your day consists of some portion being on Slack, responding to emails, being available to phone calls, no problem. Schedule that time, but also reserve some amount of time for that reflective work. And everybody has different proportions. If you're a computer engineer, most of your day is reflective, right? We know that bugs are caused in computer code by distraction more than anything else. So most of your day needs to be reflective. If you're in sales or customer service, well, then most of your day is probably going to be reactive work. But the idea is in both jobs to schedule that time and keep it sacred, keep it safe, so that if you need that reflective time, you have it protected.
One last question I want to ask before we kind of end this session for the day, but it sounds like a lot of the things that you recommend, a lot of the things that you talk about, revolve around empowerment and empathy for self. Like you have to empower yourself to be able to take these actions and do these things and feel like you have the ability to make those decisions, but you also have to be empathetic towards yourself. So what advice do you give to people on how they balance those things?
What's the dichotomy? What's the trade-off?
It's not necessarily a trade-off, but a lot of people aren't empathetic towards themselves, and when they don't feel that they are, they don't sense that they have the power to empower themselves to make those decisions. Like we just talked about, people feel like they're powerless when everyone's coming at them with distraction, when you're actually saying, no, you have the ability to decide on what's going to be important and what's not.
Yeah, now this is a fantastic point, particularly when it comes to people who say, my boss controls my schedule. I don't control my schedule. My boss controls my schedule. Well, there are several techniques that we can use in the book to help manage our managers. So one of the benefits of having a time box calendar is that now you have an artifact. You see, managers across the country, most managers have no idea how you spend your time. And let me let you in on a little secret. As somebody who has managed a lot of people in my day, we're dying to know what the hell you're doing. But we don't want to ask you what you're doing because we don't want you to think we're micromanaging you. And so don't ask your manager to manage you. You manage your manager. How do you do that? The beauty of a time box calendar is that now you have an artifact. You have something you can show people and do what's called a schedule sync. By the way, this works at home with your significant other as well as it works with your boss. Here's how it works. Once a week, for 10, 15 minutes, you schedule time with your boss or with your significant other, and you say, here's my schedule. Okay? Here's how I'm spending my time this week. You can do that. You can send them a screenshot or whatever if you want to as well, if you can't meet physically. Then you say, okay, here's my schedule for the week. Here's how I'm planning my working hours. Now you see this other list over here? Here's the stuff I don't know where to fit in to my schedule for the week that you asked me to do, but I don't know where to put it. Can you help me prioritize what needs to get done? Right? How do you want me to spend my time? Because there's this terrible advice that's been circulating. You see it in every article where the author doesn't really know what they're talking about personal productivity. You see this horrible advice that if you want to be more productive, you have to learn how to say no. That's horrible advice. You're telling me that I should go to my boss, the person who cuts my check every month, and tell them, no, I don't want to do that? That's stupid. You're going to get fired. Instead of being the person who says no, your boss should be the person who says no. Your boss is the person who should help you reprioritize. And trust me, in just 10 minutes a week, your boss can look at your calendar, look at the stuff that they've asked you to do that you can't fit into that calendar, and you ask them, can you help me reprioritize what's more important? Your boss will worship the ground you walk on. If you do this regular practice, just 10 minutes a week, incredibly effective, will change your life.
It's good advice. Very good advice. Well, Nir, thank you very much for taking the time. We really appreciated you sharing your thoughts and your ideas and your insights on how people can fight this whole distraction economy, the attention economy that's coming after them. Where do you want people to go after this? Where's the best place to send them? Where can they get your book?
I appreciate it. Thank you. So the book is called Indistractable, How to Control Your Attention and Choose Your Life. You can check out my blog is at nirandfar.com, but Nir is spelled like my first name. That's N-I-R and far.com. One special offer I wanted to inform you about, that if you get the book, whether you buy it on Audible, if you like audiobooks, or Amazon if you want the ebook or the print edition, doesn't matter, make sure you keep your order number. No matter where you buy it from, keep the order number on your receipt. Go to Indistractable.com. It's spelled I-N, the word distract, A-B-L-E, Indistractable.com. And if you enter in that order number, you'll get access to a complimentary video course as well as a workbook. It's a great guide to help you become indistractable that's completely free for you after you get that code.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Nir. We really appreciate it. And hope to be talking to you again soon. I hope your travels bring you back home soon. And I hope your family and you stay safe.
Thank you so much, Corey. Great talking to you.
Thank you.